Along with positioning elements with these grid lines, we can also create full areas such as a header, content, sidebar, and footer. Grid provides us with a property called Grid Template Areas to do this. First though, we need to think about how our grid will be structured using rows and columns. Looking at the diagram here, we have a header on one row, content and sidebar on the next row, and finally a footer on the third row. Therefore, we know we need 3 rows of the grid. We only need 2 columns for the content and sidebar. Remember, the header and footer areas will span across these 2 columns. This is how our grid lines will look once we set the 3 rows and 2 column tracks. So let's head back over to the text editor and see this in action. Okay, so let's get to work with setting this up. We're going to be working with these grid areas to begin with. So we can comment out all these 12 items. So let's remove all these for now with a comment. Then inside the container, we can get to work with adding our header. So let's add the header element and the text of header 2. We also had a main section for the content. Then a sidebar with the aside element. And then down at the bottom, we also had a footer. Okay, so we can see these areas better. Let's add a border to all 4. So within the style section, let's go for the header, the main, the aside, and the footer. And add the border property of 1 pixel and then a dashed line. Over to the browser, hit refresh, and there's our 4 content areas we've just added. Then back over to our grid template rows and columns, and we can begin to set this up. So up to the top. Remember, for the columns, we need 2. 1 for the content section and 1 for the sidebar. So remove the repeat. And the first one can be 3 FR, and the sidebar can be smaller. So 1 FR is fine. Then onto the rows. So we need 3 rows, 1 for the header, 1 for the content, and 1 for the footer. The header can be 1 FR, 3 FR for the main content, and then 1 FR for the footer. If we now reload the browser, this is how our 4 sections will now look. Since we set 2 columns, the 4 elements are arranged onto 2 rows, like we see here. So let's get to work with changing this with our grid template area. So let's add the CSS property in, grid template areas. Remember the S on the end. So with this property, we set up names for each section. These names are arranged like a table. We have 2 columns and 3 rows. So our names are arranged like a 3 by 2 table. So we add the quotations for our first row, and then we can add our second row, and then a third row in just below. Remember to add the semicolon right at the end too. So we want the header area to span across these 2 top columns. So we add header in the first column, and then header in the second column too, to cause this to span right across the row. For our second row, we want the content to be on the left, and then a sidebar on the right. And then the bottom, just like the header, we want the footer area to span both of the columns. If we save that, we won't see any difference in the browser just yet with a refresh. We first need to place our items inside of these sections. We do this with the same 4 properties we've already used. If we go down to item 1, we used grid row start, row end, column start, and column end. Or we can use the shorthand of grid row and grid column, which we've already looked at. So let's set this up. First of all, we can target the header. So we set the size of this header by using grid row and grid column. So first of all, grid row, this can be the header section, which we set up at the top. So which is just here. And then the same for grid column. So just below this, add grid column, and also set this to the header area which we created. We'll then repeat this for the main, aside, and footer. The main section, we set the grid row to be the content, and then the grid column to also be the content too. We also created an area for the sidebar, and we'll give this a name of sidebar here. So down for the sidebar section, which was the aside element. Just like before, we do grid row and set this to be the sidebar. Grid column, this is the sidebar 2. And then finally the footer area. Grid row, the name of footer, and grid column. And this is the footer 2. Save that and then over to the browser and refresh. Okay, good. So just to recap, we have our header spread across the top. This is because we've set the header to have a grid row and grid column of this header template that we set above. So just here, which spans across our 2 columns of the first row. We then set the second row to be divided between the content, which is going to be the free FR section. And then the sidebar will be 1 FR. We define these below, again using grid row and grid column for the aside and the main section. Then at the very bottom we set the footer area, and just like the header, this also spans across the 2 columns. Setting the footer and header to be the full width of the page. Good, so this leaves our layout now complete and how we intended using grid template areas. Next we'll take a look at nesting grids.